It's one thing to follow immigration news day to day, but recently something pretty unexpected happened, and frankly, quite unsettling. It's impacting a specific group here in the U.S., international students. A lot of them suddenly had their visas canceled, their academic records basically terminated.
Yeah, and what's really wild is how quickly some of those actions are now being, well, walked back. Partially, anyway.
Exactly. It's complex. Okay, let's try and unpack this.
Right. This isn't just policy talk, is it? It's about, thousands of actual people, and it has huge ripple effects for universities, too. The speed is what gets me. The crackdown was so fast and wide, and then this reversal, or partial reversal, seems almost just as quick, though maybe not as complete.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're really going to examine this recent focus, maybe crackdown is the right word, on international students, specifically these visa cancellations and the termination of their SEVIS records.
That's the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System record, right? Crucial.
Crucial. And to get our heads around it, we've looked at reports from CBS Evening News, Inside Higher Ed, Truthout, WUSA 9, AP, Politico, KSL.com, WHYY, plus a detailed briefing document.
A good range of sources there.
Yeah, trying to be thorough. Our goal here really is to figure out why this happened, the motivations, how people responded legally and socially, and what it all means for the students and for higher education in the U.S.
It's a big tangle, isn't it? You've got immigration law, constitutional questions, First Amendment stuff, and then the plain economics of how universities run.
Absolutely.
And if you step back, it really throws a spotlight on that tension, between things like national security, foreign policy, and just the basic rights of people who are here, even if they aren't citizens.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. What really kicked off this intensified scrutiny?
Well, the sources point to a recent, pretty assertive approach from the Trump administration, specifically towards international students. And they mainly used two methods, two tools, if you like. First, the State Department was directly revoking visas, just canceling them. Second, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was terminating student records in that SEVIS database we mentioned.
SEVIS.
Yeah.
Right, the digital record that proves they're here legally as students.
Exactly. If that's terminated, you're effectively out of status immediately. It's serious.
And this wasn't just like a handful of students here and there. What kind of scale are we talking about?
Oh, no, it was significant. We're talking thousands of students right across the country. One source mentioned about 4,700 students had their SEVIS records terminated by ICE pretty much all at once.
4,700, wow.
Yeah. And on top of that, you had all the individual visa cancellations from the State Department, so the total number affected was almost certainly higher.
Thousands. That's a staggering number of lives just thrown into chaos. What reasons did the administration actually give? What was the official line?
Well, there were sort of two main justifications put forward. First, they brought up alleged anti-Semitic speech and pro-Palestinian activism happening on college campuses. The argument was that this kind of expression went against U.S. foreign policy interests.
Okay, that's one. What was the second?
The second reason involved flagging minor legal issues that showed up in the NCIC database. That's the National Crime Information Center.
Minor issues, like what?
Well, that's the really striking part. Often these were things like charges that had already been dismissed or really low-level offenses, not serious convictions in many cases.
So dismissed charges could get your student status pulled. That seems disproportionate.
It certainly raised eyebrows. And that first justification, linking campus protests, particularly pro-Palestinian ones, to anti-Semitism and foreign policy, that was obviously very charged given recent events.
Definitely. And legally, how did they justify using foreign policy interests to cancel student visas based on speech?
Yeah, that's a key point. They leaned heavily on a pretty broad provision in immigration law. It basically gives the Secretary of State the power to cancel a visa if they think it's necessary for U.S. foreign policy.
Has that been used much before?
Well, according to the experts cited in our sources, historically, no. It's been used very sparingly, usually for, direct national security threats or major diplomatic issues, not typically for speech or protests on a university campus.
So using it this way was unusual.
Highly unusual, yeah. And it immediately raises big questions, right? Like, to what extent can someone's political views, expressed here, be deemed such a threat to foreign policy that you cancel their visa?
It touches on free speech, doesn't it? Even for non-citizens.
Absolutely. And look, the courts have said non-citizens might have slightly different First Amendment protections than citizens, okay? But the core idea that the government shouldn't target people just because of their viewpoint, that's fundamental. There's actually a quote from Justice Alito, not exactly known as a liberal, saying viewpoint discrimination is poison to free society. And this crackdown seemed to push right up against that, especially in universities, which are supposed to be places for, well, free debate.
Okay, so those are the stated reasons. Let's make this more concrete. Can we look at some individual cases? The name Mahmoud Khalil came up a lot.
Yes, Mahmoud Khalil. His case is really significant because he's not just on a student visa, he's a green card holder, a legal permanent resident.
A permanent resident?
Yeah.
Targeted for deportation.
Yes, and he's a graduate student at Columbia University, the stated reason for targeting him. His leadership role in pro-Palestinian protests on campus, which the administration explicitly labeled as anti-Semitic. The Secretary of State spelled that out as the basis.
Wow. And what happened in court?
Well, this is quite startling. An immigration judge actually allowed the deportation case against him to move forward.
Even for a green card holder?
Yeah.
On those grounds?
Yeah. The judge basically said she didn't have the jurisdiction, the power, to second-guess the Secretary of State's decision that his presence was against U.S. foreign policy interests.
So the foreign policy justification hold a lot of weight legally, it seems?
It really highlights the power baked into that specific bit of immigration law. I mean, if a permanent resident can face deportation for protest activity, that's serious.
Absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
What about Ranjani Srinivasan? Her story also seemed quite dramatic.
Ranjani Srinivasan, yeah. She was a doctoral student also at Columbia. Her situation is particularly stark because she actually fled the country, went to Canada.
Fled? Why?
Her student visa was suddenly revoked right after she took part in a pro-Palestinian protest. And get this, the actual charges against her from that protest, things like obstructing a sidewalk, failure to disperse, they were dismissed by the court.
So the charges were dropped, but they still revoked her visa. What reason did they give for that?
Well, according to the reports, the Department of Homeland Security claims she was involved in activities supporting Hamas. But, crucially, they apparently offered no proof for that claim.
No proof.
None presented, based on our sources. The Secretary of Homeland Security even called her a terrorist sympathizer. Her lawyer called that label, completely absurd.
So now she's stuck in Canada.
Yeah, basically in limbo, hoping she can clear her name and somehow get back to finish her PhD. It just shows the immediate life-altering impact these actions had.
It really does. Then there's Mohsen Madawi. His case sounds incredibly complex, maybe even more alarming.
Yes, Mohsen Madawi. He's also a student activist at Columbia and a Palestinian permanent U.S. resident. Like Khalil, he was involved in organizing pro-Palestinian protests. He actually did an interview with 60 Minutes.
Okay.
And that apparently caught the attention of a group called Betar.
What's their connection here?
Well, Betar is described by the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, as an extremist Zionist group. And according to reports, Betar claimed publicly that they sent the Trump administration a list with thousands of protesters' names urging they be deported.
Thousands. And Madawi?
Madawi was supposedly right at the top of their list. After this, he started getting serious threats, credible threats, and he went into hiding. Understandably.
Gosh. Living in hiding under threat.
Yeah.
What happened next?
So while he's in hiding, he gets a notification for his U.S. citizenship appointment, something he'd been waiting for. Given everything, he suspected it might be a setup, a honey trap.
And was it?
It seems so. When he showed up for the citizenship appointment, ICE detained him.
Unbelievable. Just detained him at his citizenship interview. And his personal background makes his situation even more fragile, right?
Absolutely. Madawi is stateless. He was born in a refugee camp in the West Bank. So for him, deportation isn't just going back somewhere. It's potentially being sent to an active war zone.
That's terrifying.
He's actually been quoted saying he feels compassion for both Palestinians and Jewish people, and even described times he stood up against anti-Semitism himself. Yet he was accused of it. His story just crystallizes the human cost here.
These stories are powerful, and deeply troubling. But it wasn't just these high-profile activists, right? You mentioned thousands were flagged through that NCIC database.
Right, that's the other major part of this. About 4,700 students had their SEVIS records terminated because their names popped up in the NCIC database.
And what exactly landed them in that database?
That's the most worrying part. For many, it wasn't criminal convictions. It could be that charges were filed but then dismissed, or it could be for incredibly minor things, unpaid traffic tickets, apparently. Even just being listed as a witness in a police report.
A witness. Just being a witness could get your student status terminated.
It appears so in some cases. One example given was Rajesh Badam. He was a key witness for the prosecution in a theft case. He was fingerprinted as part of that process, and then his SEVIS record got terminated. He wasn't accused of anything himself.
That seems completely divorced from the normal rules. What are the usual federal regulations for terminating an F1 student visa?
Well, generally, the rules say your F1 status can be terminated if you're convicted of a violent crime, and the sentence is for a year or more in prison.
A conviction for a serious violent crime.
Exactly. So terminating status based on a minor infraction or a dismissed charge or just being flagged in a database without any conviction, that's a huge departure from standard procedure.
Okay, so given all this, the broad justifications, the targeting of speech, the use of minor infractions, hardly surprising this ended up in court.
Not surprising at all. The legal backlash was swift and significant. We're talking dozens, maybe hundreds, of lawsuits filed all over the country by students and their legal teams.
What were the main arguments in these lawsuits?
The core arguments were pretty consistent. Lack of due process, students weren't being given a chance to respond or appeal properly, and that the government was basically overstepping its legal authority.
And I imagine the First Amendment issues were front and center, especially for the students targeted for protests.
Absolutely. As we discussed, even though non-citizens might have different levels of protection, targeting people because of their political views is a major red line. That viewpoint discrimination argument was key.
You mentioned Justice Alito's quote earlier.
Right. Poison to free society. And groups like the ACLU of Utah filed suits specifically on behalf of students targeted for their speech. Other organizations like ALA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration were also really active in supporting these legal challenges.
So the legal system pushed back. What did the judges actually do?
They intervened quite forcefully in many cases. Federal judges issued over 40 temporary restraining orders, or TMROs.
TROs, what do those do?
They basically put an immediate stop to the action. In this case, they blocked ICE from terminating those SEVIS records based on the NCIC flags, at least temporarily.
And what were the judges saying in these orders?
They were expressing serious doubts about the legality of what ICE was doing, particularly questioning the idea that minor infractions justified termination. One judge, Judge Nichols, called ICE's argument a slippery slope.
A slippery slope? That's strong language from a judge.
Yeah. Another judge, Judge Calvert, flat out ruled that the terminations were likely arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion. That's pretty standard legal language for finding a government action unlawful.
So the judiciary wasn't buying the administration's rationale?
Not in these cases, no. There were also reports of judges getting frustrated in court because the government lawyers couldn't clearly explain the legal basis for their authority. Judge White apparently used the phrase whack-a-mole, trying to pin down their justification.
Whack-a-mole, okay. It sounds like the legal challenges were having a real impact. Now, you mentioned that group Betar earlier, claiming they sent lists. Did the sources shed any more light on the role of outside groups?
Well, Betar definitely made that claim publicly that they provided names, including Mohsen Madawi's, to the administration demanding deportation. ICE officially denied working directly with Betar on tips from their hotline. But the fact remains that people on those alleged lists were targeted. It raises questions, about where the information driving these actions came from and what influence groups like Betar might have had, even indirectly, especially remembering the ADL considers them extremists.
Right. It has another layer of concern. Through all this legal and political maneuvering, what was the actual tangible impact on the students themselves?
Oh, the impact was just devastating. Students talked about living in existential hell, constant fear, crippling uncertainty, their whole lives thrown up in the air.
Existential hell. That's intense.
It is. We heard about students going into hiding, like Madawi, others fleeing the country, like Ranjani Srinivasan to Canada. They were terrified, not just for their education, but for their safety, their futures.
From the practical consequences.
Huge. Losing jobs they might have had on campus or related to their studies, missing final exams, missing graduation after years of work, and then the massive uncertainty about ever being able to re-enter the U.S. One lawyer said some students were just too frightened to wait for the courts and basically chose to leave.
Just gave up and left.
Nah.
Heartbreaking. And beyond the individual students, what about the universities? What did this mean for higher education overall?
Well, it hit them hard, too, on multiple levels. Financially, U.S. colleges rely pretty heavily on international students. They pay significant tuition, often full price.
How significant.
The billions of dollars contributed to the economy. Something like 81% of international undergrads and 61% of grad students pay their own way entirely without relying on U.S. financial aid. So losing them or even just seeing fewer apply, that's a big financial hit.
And did experts expect fewer students to come?
Yes, there is real concern about a drop in enrollment, maybe even worse than what happened after the travel ban back in 2017. Experts like William Brustein and Stephen Yellor were quoted expressing serious worries.
A chilling effect, basically.
Exactly, especially on applications from key countries like India and China. An IDP education survey suggested that was already happening.
And it's not just about money, is it? What about research and innovation?
Right. That's another huge piece. International graduate students are absolutely vital for STEM research in the U.S. Many labs rely on them. And this was happening alongside cuts to research funding, which made things worse.
So a double whammy for research.
Yeah. Some universities actually had to pause admissions for certain graduate programs because of the uncertainty and funding issues. There's a real fear of losing that pipeline to in-demand high-tech jobs, weakening U.S. innovation potential.
And just the day-to-day operations for universities.
Chaos. International student offices were scrambling, trying to figure out what was going on, how to advise students whose SEVIS records just vanish overnight. Some advisors were apparently even telling students maybe they should stop attending class because technically they were out of status.
What a nightmare for everyone involved. Did the universities push back publicly?
Some did, certainly. But there was also a sense that some colleges were hesitant to challenge the administration too loudly, maybe because they depend on federal funding in other areas. It put them in a difficult position.
A very tough spot. Okay, so a picture of widespread disruption, fear. But then you mentioned a reversal. What happened? Why did the administration change course, at least partially?
Yes. Okay, so the reversal. Basically, facing all those legal defeats, remember, over 100 lawsuits filed, and with DHS effectively admitting in court they didn't have the authority to unilaterally terminate SEVIS records just based on those NCIC database flags.
The courts really forced their hand.
It seems that way. The Trump administration announced they were reversing course on those specific SEVIS terminations. They said they would reinstate the records for the thousands of students affected by the NCIC flag issue.
So that's good news for those specific students then.
Definitely a huge relief for them. The stated reason was, well, the legal reality and the admission about lacking authority. The Justice Department also put out a statement saying they were working on a new policy framework for how these kinds of terminations might be handled in the future.
A new policy framework, so it's not totally resolved.
Right. While the immediate SEVIS reinstatements for that group are happening, this new policy is still being developed, so there's still some underlying uncertainty about what the rules will be going forward.
Okay, that covers the SEVIS terminations based on the NCIC flags. But what about the other group? The students who had their visas canceled by the State Department, often because of the political speech or foreign policy arguments.
Yeah, that's the big remaining question mark. There hasn't been any similar broad announcement about reversing those outright visa cancellations.
So the students are still in limbo?
It appears so, largely. A federal official was quoted mentioning some quality control being applied to those decisions, which maybe suggests a review is happening case by case, but it's far from clear. The outcome for them is still very uncertain.
And ICE still have the power to terminate SEVIS for other reasons.
Oh, absolutely. They can still terminate records if students, fail to maintain their grades or drop too many classes or engage in other activities deemed unlawful. That authority hasn't changed, and those legal fights trying to get broader protections against arrests or transfers for students, those might continue too.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We saw this intense crackdown using two main tools, visa cancellations and SEVIS terminations. The reasons given were tied to political speech, framed as foreign policy concerns, and also these minor run-ins with law enforcement via the NCIC database.
Right. And this triggered massive disruption, fear, a wave of lawsuits.
Which led to significant pushback from the courts.
Exactly, resulting in this partial reversal specifically on the SEVIS terminations tied to the NCIC flags, because the legal ground for those seemed weakest.
But leaving major uncertainty for those whose visas were canceled for other reasons, especially political expression.
Precisely. Those two distinct tracks, the foreign policy speech track and the minor infraction database track, both raised really fundamental questions about due process, government authority, and the rights of non-citizens here.
And the ripples go way beyond the students themselves, don't they? We're talking about the health of U.S. universities financially and academically, and maybe even our reputation globally.
No question. University finances, our edge in science and tech, our image as a place that welcomes global talent, it's all interconnected with how we treat international students. These actions, even with the partial walkback, send a pretty strong signal, maybe not a welcoming one, to the rest of the world.
It really does. So as we finish this deep dive, it leaves me wondering, and maybe it leaves you, our listener, wondering too, what does this whole episode really tell us about how we balance things like national security and foreign policy against the rights and the really valuable contributions of international students in a democracy like ours? And even with this recent reversal on the SEVIS records, what might be the lasting effects, the long-term consequences of these actions, both the crackdown and the way it was handled, on our universities and our place in the world?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Lots to think about there.